Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good night from whatever part of planet Earth you are joining this second day of the first international workshop of Institutionalist Development Macroeconomics Research Group. We have the pleasure to give us to hear with us today Professor Peter Scott. I will make a brief presentation of Professor Peter Scott. Professor Peter Scott is a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, since 2003. He was previously a professor at the University of Aarhus from 1987 to 2003. His research interests are macroeconomics and income distribution. He is an associate editor of the Journal of Macroeconomica and Economia, published widely in scientific journals such as Cambridge Journal of Economics, Macroeconomica, Structural Change in Economic Dynamics, Journal of Post-Keynes Economics, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Review of Keynesian Economics, among others. He has published two books, Calder's Growth and Distribution Theory, from Peter Lang-Verlag in 1989, and Conflict and Effective Demand in Economic Growth at Cambridge University Press, also in 1989. He was also a researcher of the Institutionalist Development Macroeconomics Research Group, and he is the keynote speaker for today. The title of his presentation will be Aggregate Demand in a Dual Economy. Peter, good morning, and many thanks for have accepted our invitation to be today at our workshop, and the audience is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity to present some of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years. The title of the paper is Aggregate Demand Policy in a Dual Economy, and I think in many ways what I'll be talking about today maybe complements some of the talks that we heard yesterday. It's the same theme, but it's a different angle, and hopefully it will bring something new to the table. So let me start with a bit of motivation. Part of that motivation is, if you want, negative. I think that post-Keynesian theories sometimes can be misleading. Sometimes they may send a message that is potentially dangerous, wrong, and actually, I think, un-Keynesian. Related to that, I think the supply side is important, and I think that is sometimes ignored. The demand side is important too, of course, and had I given this talk to a group of maybe more mainstream orthodox people, I would have stressed the demand side is important here. But if one addresses a more Keynesian structuralist audience, I think it's important to emphasize the supply side angle. So the punchlines, if you want, are quite simple. It is that boosting aggregate demand is not a development strategy. Aggregate demand is important, but it's not just a matter of increasing aggregate demand. It's also that we need to make a clear distinction between structural aggregate demand problems and structural transformation problems. And if you have a structural aggregate demand problem, you may indeed need a sustained stimulus, sustained aggregate demand stimulus, but that is not the case in a developing economy, in a dual economy. Okay. What do I have in mind when I say that some post-Keynesians may send the wrong signal or a dangerous signal? Well, the post-Keynesian view, if at least part of it, can be characterized by a strong focus on the goods market, almost an exclusive focus on the goods market. Aggregate demand is seen as the driver of growth, and there are no binding supply-side constraints. I don't think this is a caricature. I'm aware, of course, that there are some people who do talk supply side, but I don't think this is a caricature of at least the message that may seem to be sent from the post-Keynesian camp. Let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate. If you look at Kaleskian models of wage-led growth, then it is, if you look at Eckhard Hein or Marc Lavoie's well-known textbooks, it's a defining characteristic that there are no labor or capital constraints in these models. It's aggregate demand that drives economic growth. I think underemployment in dual economies, and dual economies would be the economies where these models would seem to fit best, because in dual economies you have a perfectly elastic labor supply to the modern sector. But even in dual economies, you do not have the absence of supply-side constraints. They're still there. Let me add, and this is sort of an aside to what I will be talking about today, that I think, in fact, it is largely irrelevant whether aggregate demand is wage or profit-led. And I do not understand why it has been given this much attention. Why is it irrelevant? Well, imagine that you found that some desirable shift of income towards wages had a negative impact on aggregate demand. Well, what would you do? You would implement the desirable change in income distribution, and then you would engage in a little bit of expansionary fiscal policy, and voila, problem is solved. So income distribution has many other important effects, including some I'll be talking about today. But whether aggregate demand is wage-led or profit-led, it seems to me, is basically irrelevant. Modern monetary theory, again, advocating expansion of aggregate demand. Employer of last resort programs have been advocated in a number of countries, including, I believe, Argentina, and to some extent maybe implemented. Like Kaleskian models, focus on aggregate demand, but perhaps an interesting and striking contrast to the Kaleskian models. Unlike these models here, policy now is omnipotent. We can fix anything by just having expansionary fiscal policy as long as we have a sovereign currency. Distribution is seen as a distraction, so rather than saying we need wage-led growth because that's the only way we can influence aggregate demand, the story now is we don't need to worry about progressive taxation or other policies to curb luxury consumption, to address these distributional issues. We can just go ahead and use aggregate demand policy. But again, aggregate demand policy as a driver of growth. Straffi and super multiplier models also see autonomous demand as a driver of long-run growth, no labor constraints. So I think there is evidence that this is the message. I know there may be caveats sometimes if you push people, but these are positions that are widely argued, and these are the positions that I find potentially dangerous, not least in a dual economy context, and that's what I want to talk about today. As a little kind of aside here, I think it's questionable whether in fact these positions are Keynesian or are Kaleskian. Keynes did not ignore the supply side. Anyone reading the general theory will realize that. And Kaleski certainly did not either. I have a little quote here where he talks about how unemployment in underdeveloped countries differs fundamentally from unemployment in developed economies. In underdeveloped countries, the underemployment is the result of a shortage of capital. It's not a deficiency of effective demand. So the idea that Kaleski would endorse this aggregate demand is the only driver of economic growth, I think is questionable. That's not important. Kaleski could be wrong. So the real issue, of course, is do we need to look more carefully at the supply side? Okay, so brief overview of what follows. I will first look at a goods market equilibrium in a closed economy, one sector, and then I'll turn to two sector interactions. I think these are important because we need to understand the interactions between sectors to look at relative wages, distributional conflict, and inflation. And I think that is the way that supply side constraints often manifest themselves. I'll talk very briefly about an open economy extension. That'll be very brief. So in that sense, it's somewhat different from maybe the focus of yesterday's discussion. That's not because the open economy angle is unimportant, but because I think I can make the points that I want to address today, I can make them simpler and more clearly by not moving straight to an open economy version, and then a little bit of conclusion. Let me mention that what I'll be talking about today draws primarily on three articles. So should anyone be interested in some of the arguments or want to see substantiation of some of the claims I'll be making, then hopefully you'll be able to find them there. Okay, the one sector economy. If you take a very simple standard Keynesian model, closed economy, then we have an equilibrium condition that says output equal to consumption plus investment plus government consumption. I have scaled it here. I've divided through by the capital stock, which obviously is useful if one is going to talk about growth. The I over K, I've rewritten now as G plus delta. G is the growth rate of the economy. If we're thinking of a situation, steady growth path, long run growth path, where we have a constant output capital ratio, then the accumulation rate, the net accumulation rate will be equal to the growth rate of the economy, and that's what I denote by G. Gamma will be my indicator of the ratio of government consumption to capital. That's a contentious issue, political views, ideologies, people differ, how many school teachers, how many police officers should be hired. I'll assume that somehow we have made a decision on the appropriate size of the government sector, on the appropriate size of spending carried out on consumption of goods and services. That has been decided. I don't think we should decide how many police officers we have based on aggregate demand issues, basically. So gamma will be treated basically as a constant that we have determined in one way or another. If you look at this equilibrium condition, so we have a given output capital ratio, think Leontief production function, a utilization rate that is at the desired rate. We don't have persistent deviations from that. Then the left-hand side is given. We've determined gamma. We have a growth rate here. And if you are in a mature economy, and by a mature economy, I mean one whose growth rate is constrained by the growth of the labor force in efficiency units. So that determines G. So gamma, G, delta, sigma, all determined. That means C over K will somehow have to adjust if we want to maintain full employment growth. Now, we can have a problem. If we have a private saving rate that happens to be high, and we have a low natural growth rate, then we may have a structural deficit, a structural aggregate demand problem in the absence of fiscal policy that is expansionary. So what do? Well, you need to adjust taxes. I fix my government spending on goods and services, but you adjust taxes You give tax cuts that boost private consumption. You'll get debt developing. As debt develops, and that's wealth for the private sector, you'll find consumption increasing, and you may not need to maintain deficits. But however that pans out, and you can examine the dynamics of it, we may need some kind of permanent boost to aggregate demand if you are in a mature economy. Let me add, mature economy does not mean full employment. You can have 10, 15% unemployment in an economy that's mature. It does not mean that the natural growth rate is exogenously given. You can have endogenous productivity growth. You can have Verdorn laws. You can have productivity growth that's related to the employment rate. You can have those endogeneities there. What it means is that there are limits to how much productivity growth or the growth of the labor force in natural units will respond to increases in aggregate demand. As a simple test, think of what would happen in say France if we were to expand output aggregate demand at 10% a year as in China. We might be able to do that, boosting aggregate demand. We might be able to expand output 10% a year for 1 year or maybe 2 years, but it's not something that's sustainable. It's not sustainable to do that in Japan or in the US or in Germany. These economies are mature. Dual economies are not mature. You have a lot of underemployment. You can, for a prolonged period, 20 years, you can grow at 10% without running into labor constraints. Dual economies differ from mature economies in that you do not have the structural aggregate demand problem. If you have high saving, so you were to have a low private consumption to capital ratio, gamma is maybe low, sigma is high, so you have seemingly a deficit, but no, you would want to have high accumulation. You would want to have G be as high as possible because you want to achieve the transformation of the economy. You want to draw people from the low productivity sectors into the modern sector. What you have is a structural transformation problem, and that is very different. So how should one conduct functional finance? Functional finance is the term I've been using for it. I probably should, in this context, maybe I should refer to it as the structuralist, development macroeconomic policy. Functional finance in a dual economy. How should we conduct fiscal policy so as to achieve the structural transformation that we want? Well, you first need to figure out what is a suitable target accumulation rate. We would like it to be as high as possible, but we need to be aware of the fact that there is a growth consumption trade-off. There is a supply side. We have a modern sector that is constrained by the available capital stock. If we want to grow very fast, we have to squeeze consumption of modern sector output. I'll assume that it's the modern sector that produces the investment goods. So you have this trade-off, and that means, of course, you don't just go as fast as you possibly could. But once you've decided, once you've balanced this growth consumption trade-off, you then need to make sure that you create the space for this investment. If you want high accumulation rate, then you need to somehow have low consumption. If we treat public consumption, the number of policemen and the number of teachers and health workers, whatever, if we treat that as having been decided through some debate, political debate, we've decided that, then what is left is regulating tax rates. If we want a high growth rate, we'll now have to squeeze private consumption. We would need to have high taxes. We get public sector surplus, and we get low debt or maybe even negative debt. So fast accumulation would typically be associated with not large deficits and high debt, but the opposite. It's not enough to just make the space for investment. You need to ensure incentives for the modern sector to actually fill that space, to actually carry out the private investment. If you rely on private investment, which most economists do, and that's probably a reasonable thing, not to have complete the dominance of the public sector in the investment decision. So you want to give the private sector the incentives to carry out the investment. That means there's a very important role for policy at just stabilizing demand. You don't want very volatile demand for modern sector output. You want to stabilize it, have it grow along the target growth path that you've decided on. It's not enough just to have the growth rate of aggregate demand following the target. You also need to make sure that profitability is sufficient to actually give the incentive for the private sector to carry out the investment. So profitability of the modern sector becomes a concern, and that in an open economy context, that's why I put it in brackets, because I'm not going to talk an awful lot about it, leads back to the competitive real exchange rate, which was a recurrent theme in yesterday's presentations. Okay, so this was all within the confines of a one sector model. But if you're talking dual economy, then I think it is useful in some ways, and sometimes absolutely critical, to disaggregate and to look at the two sectors explicitly, to look at their interactions. So my very simple stylized two sector economy here will have a formal modern sector. It'll look just like what I showed you before in terms of the one sector economy. It'll have a Leontief production function. There'll be markup pricing. Then there'll be an informal traditional sector. It'll use only labor input. That's sort of a stylized version of the informal sector being less capital intensive than the formal sector. And it'll be the residual employer in inverted commas, because it's probably not so much employers and wage labor you find there, but in many cases, sort of self-employment, street vendors, whatever. So whoever doesn't get a job in the modern sector will kind of move into the informal sector, try to make a living one way or the other. Equations, just quickly: the formal sector, Leontief, and utilization at the desired rate. This is very much a long run, medium long run story. It's a story about development. I'll assume that we carry out our fiscal policy so as to stabilize the economy around the trajectory that we wanted to follow. So we have if need be through policy, we have aggregate demand adjusting so that output is equal to sigma k, where sigma represents this utilization, this output capital ratio at the desired utilization rate. And of course, that is equal to lambda times Lm, where Lm is employment in the modern sector, subscripts indicating sector, and lambda is the labor productivity. We have a definitional relation between the profit share and the product real wage. So the product real wage in the modern sector is equal to lambda times 1 minus the profit share, pi indicating the profit share. Informal sector, we have the residual employer story. So the number of workers in the informal sector equal to the total labor supply minus Lm minus the number of workers who find work in the modern sector. And Lm, of course, is determined by K. If you have a predetermined capital stock, aggregate demand policy ensures that it's being utilized, so the capital stock determines how many workers get drawn into the modern sector, and then the rest of them would go into the informal sector. Average income in the informal sector is demand determined. So we have, if A is real output in the informal sector, I don't, given the way I later on specify the demand structure, I don't actually need to say anything specific about the production function, but you can think of it. There's no harm in thinking of it as just a constant returns to labor, but where you may have underemployment. So if U is the unemployment rate in the informal sector, 1 minus U is the number of people who are effectively employed, then this would be a production function, and A is now given if we know U and we know LA, and then PA would be determined by aggregate, by the total demand for informal sector goods. Divide through by LA and you have the average income in the informal sector. And that'll turn out to be an important variable because workers in the formal sector get a wage, and that wage has to be certainly higher than the average income in the informal sector. Otherwise, workers would not want to move to the formal sector. But there may be a tighter constraint than that. I'll return to that later. So demand determined average income in terms of formal goods. Demand side, I'll assume that all wage income is spent on consumption. There will be taxes on formal sector wages, no taxes on informal sector incomes. That's sometimes seen as almost a definitional aspect of informality. Capital income is being taxed too. Again, I don't need to specify exactly how it's being taxed. It could be taxed at a proportional tax rate that's different or the same as the tax rate on formal wages, or it could be taxed in different ways. That doesn't matter, and I haven't specified it here. So we have total consumption by workers plus consumption out of profits, and this here is total after-tax income, wage income, and this here is still consumption out of profit income. We have investment that is equal to G plus delta times K. We have the growth rate that we set target for. And if we want output to grow at that rate with a constant output capital ratio, then this is the amount of investment. And here is my government consumption. Okay, what about the composition of demand? Well, I'll assume that investment consists entirely of modern sector goods. What about consumption? I'll assume that is both private and public consumption is split, so that a constant share of consumption goes to the informal sector, and the constant share, the other part of it, goes towards the formal sector. And that gives equilibrium conditions. Here's for the informal sector. So total income in the informal sector equal to aggregate demand, total demand for informal sector goods, which is equal to total consumption, private and public, multiplied by 1 minus alpha. So that's the share of consumption going to informal sector goods. The share alpha is going to formal sector goods. So the demand for formal sector goods equal to alpha times consumption, total consumption, plus investment. Only investment uses only modern sector goods. These are straightforward equilibrium conditions. I'm now going to first point out an asymmetry that I already mentioned, but it's important. We have an M sector with a capital constraint. So with a given capital stock, that determines output in the formal sector. It also determines employment in the formal sector. The A sector may have an elastic supply. There's underemployment, or it may have flexible prices if you treat underemployment as either zero or if you treat it as something that is constant. Either way, the average income in the informal sector is determined by demand. I can use the two equilibrium conditions for the A&M sector to now derive an expression for relative wages. I'll talk about relative wages. That's the shorthand in the informal sector. It may not be formal wages, but just average incomes. What is this ratio? Well, given that there's taxes in the formal sector, then I need to, if I want to disposable income, the real income that workers have left, I need to have omega A, omega M, but I need to, of course, adjust for the taxation of formal sector incomes. And you can now derive this equation. I won't do it here, but what you have is the output capital ratio, you have the target growth rate, depreciation rate, and then you have demand composition parameters, and you have tax rates, you have the income distribution, and then here you have a term in K, and that's basically a measure of the size of the formal sector. So as you develop, as workers move into the formal sector, the ratio of formal sector employment to total labor force would go up, and this would be rising non-linearly as G goes up. So what this says is that as you develop, as you grow, then the wage premium. This here is an inverse measure of the wage premium. The wage premium declines. You get relative wages in the formal sector going up. You get duality gradually being reduced. You get a move towards greater equality in terms of incomes across sectors. But of course, that process can only go to a certain extent. At some point, we'll reach maturity, and certainly maturity will have been reached once the wages are the same, once the incomes are the same in the two sectors. So we need to impose this condition as something that clearly has to be satisfied. However, we may need something in the real world. We may need something stronger than this. Why is that? And that brings me to an issue that puzzled me for a long time, and that's the observation that inflationary pressures occur, and they occur in developing economies, even though there may be a very high wage premium in the M sector, and there's significant underemployment. In those contexts, a sort of standard labor market story would seem to suggest that there should be no pressures. You have lots of unemployment. You have a high wage premium in the modern sector. Why would you see wage pressures happening in the cost push pressures happening in the modern sector? And I think the answer to that puzzle, at least the answer that at the moment I find most convincing, is that the wage setting in the modern sector is driven by path-dependent wage norms. So you have markup pricing, and you may or may not have a fixed profit share. In the simple version, you may have a fixed profit share. I'll later on relax that. But you have markup pricing, and then you have wage setting influenced by these path-dependent wage norms. So if you violate a wage norm, if you squeeze wages below what modern sector workers consider fair, then you would get cost push inflation. Now, path-dependent wage norms. Well, let me try to illustrate what I have in mind by first a simple thought experiment. Imagine that you're paid $20 an hour. And this seems fair. You've been getting $20 an hour for as long as you can remember, and that seems to be the fair wage. You're happy. Then, unexpectedly, you get a pay rise to 25. You hadn't thought that was going to happen, but it seems okay. You're obviously worth more than 25, more than $20. You get 25 now. What's your reaction? Well, you'll be very happy. And then probably you would relatively soon get used to the idea that, yes, I'm worth 25. That adjustment is not hard to make. It's much harder to go around thinking, look, I'm only worth fair. I'm only worth 20. That is what is fair. I'm being paid 25. I ought to be grateful. That's something that would quickly get eroded, and you start feeling, yeah, 25 is what is fair. So if after a few years your employer comes back to you and tells you, oh, that was a mistake, you know, I shouldn't have given you 25. You actually, the fair wage is 20. Then my suggestion is that most of us would think that is grossly unfair. We would have adjusted our notions of fairness to thinking that 25 is fair. If wage is kept at 20 for a long time, we may gradually, grudgingly start thinking of that as yeah, okay, that's what it is, that's fair. Our notions of fairness are path dependent, and that's not a new discovery. I've found a couple of quotes here. I could have found many other from Keynes and Marshall and lots of other people. But Marx, back in Capital Volume 1, is quite clear that if we talk the value of labor power, then there's a strong historical and moral element. Or I love this Hicks quote, when he says in his Crisis in Keynesian Economics book, he talks about the system of wages should be well established. Why? Well, then it gets the sanction of custom. It becomes what is expected, and what is expected is fair, at least at this low level of fairness. Psychologists, behavioral economists have recently emphasized the same thing. Here's a quote by Kahneman, and I think it's just very well established. If you look up any social psychology book, you'll find it. So what does that mean? If you have these path-dependent wage norms, the fact that they're path-dependent means that they can change endogenously, but it takes a while for them to change. So what you can get is gradual reductions in the wage premium without necessarily sparking hyperinflation, explosive inflationary processes. But if you get large and rapid shifts in relative incomes, then you violate the wage norms and you start a process where cost push will increase wages, that increases prices in the modern sector. And then you have the demand-determined incomes in the informal sector. They rise proportionally. So you don't adjust the unfairness. And that's what can generate this vicious, explosive process. Okay, so functional finance or structuralist macroeconomic development policies in a dual economy set the target for the growth rate, but now observe that there are really two conditions that you should keep in mind. You need to make space for accumulation. You need to make sure that you kind of squeeze consumption enough so that you don't get just excess demand in the goods market, which would either lead to a demand pull inflation, or if you're an open economy, would lead to maybe unsustainable balance of payments deficits. So you need to make space for accumulation, but you also need to pay attention to relative wages. You need to think of the inflation constraint, and that should factor into your economic policy. Making space for accumulation, well, that's exactly the same as what I talked about in the one sector framework. There's no change in this. So if we fixed our target growth rate, we have our output capital ratio in the modern sector, and then we have gamma. That means we somehow have to squeeze consumption, either the consumption by capitalists or the consumption by workers here. So adjust taxes and public spending to make the equilibrium condition here satisfied when G is equal to the target rate. It also, to repeat, means that if you have high growth, then that would typically be associated with low deficits or even surpluses on the public sector account, and low public debt. The inflation constraint. Well, if we have a path-dependent, some kind of ratio of relative incomes that is considered fair, and we need to keep the wage premium at least at that level, so we can now depict the inflation constraint as the relative wage of informal sector workers has to be below this threshold. You can now see that if this is a binding constraint, and if you were to increase G, then you'll have to do something. It was a binding constraint, and now you are increasing G, and that will require an adjustment in taxes. So populist temptations. You come into power, you would like to please everybody. It's tempting to promise too much. You have a growth target that's ambitious, but you don't want to engage in the unpopular task of reducing consumption, of raising taxes on any group. So you get this unsustainable policy, either excess demand in a closed economy and inflation demand pull, or balance of payment problems that may balloon. But you may even get problems after a sufficient squeeze if it's the wrong composition. Let's assume you don't want to squeeze the rich, so you start squeezing the poor being the workers in the formal sector. So you raise taxes on the workers, but that means you now violate the no inflation constraint. You had boosted demand maybe initially, and that would tend to increase incomes in the informal sector. You offset that now by reducing after-tax incomes in the formal sector. What you end up with is a potentially significant violation of the inflation constraint, and the result would be cost push inflation that can take hold. So what you need to do is to keep that inflation firmly in mind, and maybe use taxes on luxury goods, actually confront the entrenched interest of the rich, of the elite. Use taxes on luxury goods or profits as a way to squeeze not workers, but instead squeeze the rich. Yeah. Open economy extension, quickly. If only the modern sector good is tradable, which is a reasonable assumption, if we have a binding balance of payments constraint, which as a long run growth assumption may not be too horrible, then the equilibrium conditions for the two sectors are unchanged. If we now assume an exogenous foreign currency price of the tradable good, so a perfectly elastic demand for tradable goods, that means that the markup has to become endogenized. If firms in the modern sector raise their prices above the international good prices in common currency, then they would sell nothing. So endogenous markup in the modern sector, and we can now have modern sector accumulation. We endogenize that by making it a function of the profit share. These are very simple, stylized assumptions. I don't think they're crazy, but let me just add that you can actually get similar results to what I'm going to do now. You can get those by relaxing these assumptions significantly. I won't say you can get the results for any assumptions you make, but you can relax these assumptions significantly. If you make these assumptions, it's relatively easy to draw out a scenario that I think has some relevance. Assume that you have initially growth at the target rate. And that corresponds to having profitability that is at the rate that actually generates. Remember that G was a function of the profit share. So if you want to achieve this, that tells you that you need to have profitability at a particular level. Right? GT is given, then pi t is given. So that's where you are initially. You're growing along nicely. Then, triggered by a commodity boom or a new party that is engaging in populist policies, you get a positive shock to demand, and that leads to a violation of the inflation constraint. Okay, what could happen in this situation? Well, either you get inflation, or you have inflation targeting central banks. They engage in monetary tightening, you get an appreciating currency. In either case, whether through inflation or appreciating currencies, you will get a profit squeeze in the modern sector. What does that mean? That means accumulation rates fall. So now you get deindustrialization happening as a result of either the commodity boom or just the populist policies. It's easy if you include some dynamic increase in returns to scale in the modern sector, then it's easy to construct development traps. There are lots of models of that, and it's not hard to construct them, and they're relevant. And what it means is that as a result of this commodity boom or populist policies, falling accumulation rates, you may actually get the modern sector shrinking, so that you fall into the development trap. So even when the commodity boom is over, you're still stuck there, and a temporary boom has led to a long-term decline. I would suggest that this simple story has a number of applications, and maybe we can talk about those later. So, I've been told that I need to wrap up, and I'll do that. The general theme of this talk has been that both the supply and demand sides are important. We should not ignore the demand side the way a lot of mainstream or most mainstream theories do, but we should not ignore the supply side the way that some post-Keynesian theories seem to do either. Second theme, the policy problems are different in mature and dual economies. Mature economies may suffer, not all of them do, but they may suffer from a structural aggregate demand problem. Dual economies suffer from structural transformation problems. A high accumulation rate is desirable, but there's a modern sector supply constraint. If you engage in sensible aggregate demand policies, I've called it functional finance, but maybe it should be called structuralist development macroeconomic policy. You want to make space for the high investment, and you want to pay close attention to wage norms and cost push inflation, which means that typically if you are ambitious, if you want to grow fast and maybe also be egalitarian in the way you do it, then you need to confront entrenched interest, you need to confront the elite and luxury consumption. Long-run aggregate demand policy is important. Short-run stabilization policy is essential. I haven't talked about it. I've just assumed it was carried out. But boosting aggregate demand is not a long-term development strategy. And I think some post-Keynesian models may strengthen dangerous populist temptations. They may send the wrong message, even if proponents of the models might be willing to introduce various caveats in their discussion of these policies. I'm out of time, and I see the stern look of Professor Orero, so I will stop here and say thank you. Shall I try to stop sharing?
My microphone now. Thanks, Peter, so much for your nice presentation. I think that the topic that you cover is very interesting, but I have some comments about your presentation. Two comments, basically. The first one, when you analyzing the dual economy, you defined a target rate of accumulation. Well, this problem of targeting the rate of accumulation was addressed by classical development theory or Latin American structuralism by the idea that a large share of the investment ratio would have to be done either by state-owned enterprises or directly by government, because in low income countries like Brazil or Argentina in the 50s or 60s, the problem was not a lack of savings, but lack of incentives for investment, for private investment. So, in order to achieve a target rate of accumulation, what you need is the government to execute not an aggregate demand expansion, but to execute a large program of public investments or state-owned enterprise investments. So here in Latin America, for 2 or almost 3 decades, we done what Keynes suggested in his general theory, which is the socialization of investment. I think that in order to achieve a target rate of accumulation, investment must be state-led. So that's my first observation. Well, my second observation is regarding the model. You separate two sectors, the modern sector and the subsistence sector, but you assume that the wages in the income distribution in the modern sector is determined in a Calaxian way. All right. If we return to Liu's 1954 paper, when he introduces the subsistence sector, he said that the labor force on the subsistence sector acts as a pool of large people that can be employed by the modern sector. So the wage in the modern sector will be equal to the wage in subsistence sector plus a premium due for more harder worker conditions on the modern sector, but is real wage in the modern sector is constant, which means that when you transfer labor from subsistence sector to the modern sector, um, you increase average productivity of labor, of course, because you are transferring people from low productivity activities to high productivity activities. And so you are increasing average productivity, but without increasing wages. This means that the profit share is not constant in the modern sector, is increasing over time. And if we make the traditional Calder-Pazinetti assumption that propensity to save out of profits is higher than propensity to save out of wages, what will occur is that the saving rate will increase over time. So for in Liu's original model, there is no worry about the saving rate, because the saving rate adjusts endogenously to the rate of growth of the modern sector. But in House Prebisch work, he is very concerned about the luxury consumption of the upper classes in Latin America. But his theory is basically the same of Liu's. Of course, that he knows that the structural transformation increases the average productivity, and increasing the average productivity, you redistribute profits from income from wages to profits, which means an increase in profit share. So why how Prebisch is worried about the luxury consumption of the upper classes? Mainly because the luxury consumption of the upper classes will increase imports, and this will tight the external constraint. So the recommendations of ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin American and Caribbean, was to design a tax system in order to destimulate the luxury consumption of the upper classes, because this will contain imports and then soft the external constraint. So I think that the things that you consider in your model regarding the possible overheating of the economy will be more clearly established in an open economy model instead of a closed economy model. That's my comments.
Should I respond now?
Yes, you can respond.
I think you raise incredibly important questions, and on the first one, I don't think we disagree. It's something that I didn't talk about because I had to limit myself in various ways. But public investment has traditionally been extremely important, and that's the case whether it's public investment in sort of standard, I don't know, typically private sectors like steel and stuff. I mean, if you look at Korea and Japan, you'd find significant direct public activity as they moved into new sectors. And then in some cases, in most cases, I guess those initially sort of state-owned or state-operated activities were privatized. So that's one area where yes, you may need to have government direct intervention in the investment process. But of course, even more important, or at least as important, is the public investment in everything from infrastructure to education to health systems to, without the public sector doing that, the private sector would be at a serious disadvantage. These public investments are complementary to what the private sector may be able to do. So yes, I did not talk about the composition of investment and who should do what, but I am in absolute total agreement with you if you want to stress that there is a role for public investment. The one little thing that this implication has for some of what I said is that if you have a very large part of the investment being carried out by the public sector, then you may actually see a fast-growing economy having deficits. I mentioned as a general rule, if you're fast growing, you would typically not run big public sector deficits, and you would instead maybe even see surpluses, and you'd get low public debt. But if the government carries out a lot of the investment, then that becomes ambiguous. So that's the one direct effect on what I said. Aside from that, I don't really feel that I have the expertise to talk clearly about exactly what should the government be doing and what should not be done. Industrial policy is incredibly important, but it probably should be often tailored to the specific circumstances. You don't want to just copy what Korea did and then expect that it works in Paraguay. It may not. So I think the details of how the industrial policy should be carried out and what should be invested in is something that requires much more study than I've given it. On the model, yes, you're certainly right that the Lewis model is very different, and you're also right that the early structuralist models are different from what I present. But I guess I'll stick to my guns. I don't think the Lewis model gives an accurate description of what we see. I mean, we don't see that the equality of incomes across informal and urban sectors. So the simple equality there does not hold. The stylized facts, at least as I know, I mean, you may correct me if I'm wrong, but the stylized facts are that workers in the formal sector are significantly better off, and that informal sector workers would, almost all of them, they would be thrilled to get formal sector jobs. So you don't have the Lewis equality, and you don't have either, as far as I can tell, a kind of fixed wage premium that somehow doesn't change over time. I think the wage premium in the formal sector does change, and I think there are these historical and inertial influences, that there are these wage norms, and I think you do see wage push in the formal sector if you violate those. And that happens even if you have a high wage premium and you have lots of unemployment. I may be wrong. I mean, most of you, I can't see who's in the audience, but most of you undoubtedly know a lot more about Brazil and Latin America than I do. But my limited sort of reading of the evidence and my understanding of it is that we need some story that includes these path-dependent wage norms. Why do firms give in? Well, they give in because if you have workers who feel they're unfairly treated, then they're not as productive. So you can have that profit maximizing firms may actually be willing to acquiesce to some of these wage demands, because otherwise they will be subject to strikes, or they'll be subject to just workers who are less motivated and don't work as hard. So I think for me the stylized facts suggest that Lewis was a good starting point, but it's not accurate. And I think going back to the early structuralist models, I think, at least with my limited understanding, a lot of that literature is not available in English, and so I'm a little bit disadvantaged there. But what I have read seems to suggest a focus very much on agricultural supply constraints as sources of inflation, and those are essential consumption goods. And I don't think that captures the informal sector today. I mean, that's more of an urban service sector. It's not essential input. It's not essential consumption goods. So the inflation story needs to get rethought, which maybe it has by other people as well. But this is my suggestion that I presented here. Okay, let me stop here. I could waffle for a long time about this, but let me.
All right. We have another question from the audience, and but I ask you to answer briefly because we are running out of time. It's from Daniel Peroso. Professor Scott, excellent presentation. Besides inflationary issues, what are the consequences of the second set of populist policies presented? Is inflation the only one?
I'm not sure I understand. There was a sentence I missed. What are the consequences?
I will put on your chat. I put on the private chat so you can read it.
Second set of populist policies. The second set of populist policies those were the ones where you had a bad composition of taxes. Is that correct? Yeah. Well, if you meet the overall kind of if you create the space, then you don't get automatically kind of balance of payments deficits, and you don't get the demand pull. But if you have not paid attention to the inflation constraints, to the income distribution constraints, then you may get inflation. You could also get all kinds of other political effects, obviously, from strikes and unhappiness with public policies to military coups. I don't know. I'm not sure which way you may be thinking of this. I guess my second set of the populist policies, or what are the second? Well, I mean, okay, there are benign consequences if you want. I mean, obviously you can if you improve the incomes of some of the really poor in the informal sector, then you would say that's a wonderful implication of it. But you need to be aware that if you do that, then you may create inflationary pressures. So, and that's what I was in a sense emphasizing here. So I think what that suggests is that you want to think of how you improve the living conditions of the really poor. And one way of thinking about that would be to, rather than having cash support, which I think has become increasingly popular in development policies. So either getting cash support to the poor, if you could improve sanitation systems or public transport or access to internet in areas that are disadvantaged, then you may actually achieve some of the income distribution or welfare distribution without having the same kind of inflationary consequences. I'm not sure I've answered your question because I'm not sure I know exactly what you're after. But I think once you start thinking about inflation constraints, you would realize that there are multi-dimensions to both the kind of tax policies and income distribution policies that could be implemented, and they may not have the same effects on inflation.
All right, people, many thanks, Peter. I'm worried that we are just run out of time. Many thanks for your presentation, for accepting to deliver a keynote speech at the second day of our workshop. And I expect to see you soon as possible when this COVID-19 ends. I have taken my first shot of AstraZeneca, and my wife take her first shot of Pfizer. So I believe that at the end of August, we are both immunized, having the second shot. So people, many thanks for everyone. Now we will have 5 minutes virtual break, before the next presentation. Peter, bye-bye and see you soon.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Hello, can you hear me? Professor Andrea, can you hear me?
Your sound is a bit.
Tá me ouvindo, não?
Não, você tá com algum ruído no som.
Nada.
Eu não sei se para todo mundo, se para mim pelo menos tá.
Hello. My microphone is working. You cannot hear me.
O seu microfone tá ruim mesmo. O Luciano confirmou.
Cara,
Tenta um fone de ouvido.
vocês não estão me ouvindo.
Não, tá com algum ruído no final.
Mas impede que vocês me entendam?
Impede. O Luciano sugeriu que você saísse e entrasse novamente.
Ok. Show.
Continua.
Nada, continua a mesma coisa.
Continua a mesma coisa. Você tem um fone de ouvido?
Eu tava, eu já queria saber. Sure. Let's do this is just an introduction. We're running out of time, and I'm so sorry for this. We couldn't do an online event without some sort of technical issues. So, and I apologize. I deeply apologize for that. I would like to briefly introduce Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear?
Hello to you all. We've been having a little technical issues with Marvel, so I'm here to present myself. Well, I'm very grateful to have been invited to this workshop. I'm here to talk about Zelia Cardoso de Mello, which is the only Minister of Finance, female Minister of Finance in Brazil. So this actually brings a little bit of female diversity to this workshop, me and Zelia herself. So I hope we can actually bring a little history of economics, economic history to the workshop here, and try to bring some insights to the current situation in Brazil as well. Since I'm not very good at presenting myself, I'm just gonna share my slides and start our discussion here. So let me start. Today is the technical issues today, so please bear with me. I suppose you're seeing my screen. So the title of my presentation is Zelia Cardoso de Mello Reforms Confiscation of Savings and Lessons from the Collor Plan. For those of you who don't know Zelia, she was a minister in the Collor government, which was from 1990 to 1992. It was the first, well, actually, the first, it's sad to say that was the first, but anyway, it was government that was impeached in Brazil. And she was its first Minister of Finance, Ministra da Fazenda, actually. And I would like to start my presentation by this sentence. It's taken from a book which was written by Fernando Sabino, which is one of a great writer in Brazil, a literature writer, and he wrote a book about her, which is kind of not typical, but it adds a little bit of, I would say, poetry to her life itself. And this sentence, I think, is very, very peculiar to the time that we lived in Brazil, like the 80s and the early 90s in terms of inflation. And it goes like this: ninguém olha para cima na hora das fotos para não dizerem que estamos tentando ver a inflação. And this is very peculiar to that time, because when Collor took office in March 1990, that's the peak of inflation in Brazil. Inflation had reached 90% a month. So it was a very big challenge to actually take office as a Ministry of Finance in that situation. And we had at least 3-4 big stabilization plans until then, and that had failed, and that's one of the reasons inflation had scaled so much. So to actually come up at that point with a new idea that might actually try to battle inflation like this, it was actually very brave. It failed again, and as history taught us, it was only 4 years later that we actually were able to successfully tame inflation. But her story is something that not many people actually told it from an economics point of view. Another thing that motivated me writing about her, or at least studying her story, is a book series which I am part of. I actually write 2 chapters in this book series. This book series was organized by a very good friend of mine, Ivan Colangelo Salomão, who is a professor at the Federal University of Paraná. And it's a book series on ministers of finance in Brazil. And it goes back to the 19th century when we start having finance ministers, all the way to present time, including our most, I don't think Paulo Guedes is actually included, but our most recent past, at least, finance ministers. I wrote on the Homens do Cofre, I wrote about Mário Henrique Simons, which is one of my specializations, and then the chapter on Zelia is on Homens do Tesouro. Actually, Homens is a bit chauvinistic there, but anyway. So that's my second motivation to write about her. And the third motivation, it's a more, I would say, scientific one, would be that a lot was written about the color plan at the time that it was proposed, executed, and not much written afterwards. My colleague at the university, Alexandre Andrade, actually has a very good paper on the color plan and its reception. But it's something that it's mostly seen as something peculiar to the time, something more retained and specific to that moment. Nobody had ever written, in terms, like I said, in an economics perspective about Zelia herself. We have the book, the Sabina book, which was written right after she left office, but nothing really academic on her. And another thing that actually motivated me was that the colors thing, the color government itself, I think it has many similarities to the government that we're living right now, the Bolsonaro government, because it was a government that intended to propose many reforms that tried to push for a strong fiscal adjustment agenda. And as we can see, for many reasons, political and other, the external reasons, this agenda was not pushed forward in the way the government intended. And same things happened with the color government as well. So I think this actually brings us into a nice moment in history for us to go back to. In terms of Zelia herself, I think she's a very interesting character because, she was born and raised in São Paulo, something that many people do not realize, because she was the minister at a government that had such a liberal agenda, such an orthodox, but perhaps orthodox may not be the best term to employ to apply here, but she was in a more she was actually in the first government to apply the Washington Consensus policies, but she was actually related to João Manuel Cardoso de Mello. He was her cousin, and so she actually had a very, not close ties, but she had some ties to Unicamp and some of the economists that came out of there. When she was young, she was a member of the Communist Party in Brazil, although her father actually was a sheriff, delegado at DOPS. So she is actually a person full of contradictions. And she didn't know at first if she was going to study economics or not. She considered for some time studying journalism. So eventually she did go through economics at the University of São Paulo. Eventually she ended up becoming a professor there, even before getting her PhD. She started her PhD. We're going to talk about that in a bit in economic history, but she started teaching there before that. She worked at the economic department at the embassy, the Brazilian embassy in London, when Roberto Campos was the ambassador there in the early 80s. At this time, actually, this connection, her connection with journalism was actually very enhanced, because she had many friends at Folha de São Paulo, at the journalists who were stationed in London at the time. So this actually gave her a different perspective how economics actually was done, or how to sell herself. I would put it that way. When she came back, she started working first at the government of São Paulo, and then later, because of contacts that her cousin had. Her cousin at the time worked at Dilson Funaro's office. She ended up joining that office, and she started working at, especially dealing with state and municipal budget issues. That's actually very important, because some of the budget issues that she actually renegotiated was the state of Alagoas, which was then governed by a young governor called Fernando Collor. That's how she met Collor, and she actually had a very close personal ties with him, and they played volleyball, and they met socially at the time. When Funaro left government, she left as well. She opened a consulting firm with a few colleagues after leaving the government, and start offering services for the government of Alagoas after that. In terms of her academic career, as I said before, she worked at the University of São Paulo in economic history. I mean, usually teaching Formação Econômica do Brasil, Furtado. And her PhD supervisor was Alice Canabrava. And her PhD thesis was actually something that I thought was very interesting because it was called Metamorfoses da Riqueza de São Paulo from 1845 to 1895. And she used public inventory records, in case you didn't understand that, dados de cartório, to trace how property changed in Brazil. She wanted to see by how people recorded property, how property changed from slave property to non-slave property. So how basically it was very interesting because she did a very intensive, detailed data research, I mean, in primary sources, and to actually analyze how income distribution worked, how income and how income actually switched from one type of income to others, and that was actually she published as a book. I recommend for anybody who's interested in that type of research to actually look at it. And she has 2 or 3 other papers only, and they mostly focus on the economic history of the city of São Paulo, which I think was very interesting as well, because usually this is a very niche kind of literature area, and not something that is one would think when we think of her career as in the government, and then afterwards when she went into consulting after that. She joined the Color Campaign. She was one of the first people to join the Color Campaign. She met, like I said, Collor while working renegotiating state debts at FNR's cabinet, and after that she kept a close contact with the then governor, through her consulting firm, because of the contracts that she had with the government of Alagoas. And when he decided to run, she was one of the first people engaged in his campaign. And she was one of the main people who wrote Diretrizes de Ação do Governo Collor, which was Collor's campaign program. And I thought this was very interesting because, I mean, Sabino's book was actually written right after she left office. And it was a biography, but she was heavily interviewed for this biography. So most of it, I would say, it's very heavily biased by her views of how things were then. And I like this sentence because he says, em vão ela tentava contestar, afirmando que Collor, apesar de não ter formação de esquerda, era alguém com genuína disposição de transformar o Brasil, promover justiça social. Sabino actually uses this sentence, like saying that although Collor was not from the left, he wanted to change Brazil, to promote social justice. This shows how, at least in the book, at least for Sabino, at least then, she appears to be, it's a bit of her contradiction. I mean, she has, growing up, she's in a family where her father works at DOPS. Although she joins the Communist Party, her cousin is from Unicamp, and yet she joins a government who's clearly in a more liberal bias, and she tries to, all her life, she tries to battle being on this contradictional pathway, but let's put it this way. So this sentence, I think, captures very well what she's trying to manage throughout her life. And the color plan itself, I think we've got some literature on that. And there's some, there is some caricature about how it was proposed and how Collor, accused Lula during the 1989 campaign of proposing the plan. But the thing is, the plan was actually circulating, especially on the second runoff of the campaign through both sides. Actually, it was something that it was not. Like I said in the beginning of the presentation, people were so desperate because inflation had been going really high. Hyperinflation was going really high for such a long time that desperate times appeared to call for desperate measures. So a version of the color plan was actually circulating on, like a discussion text discussion paper for quite a while on the campaigns, and it reached a consensus in the color team after the second runoff. I mean, after they won the election, sometime in December, I think after Antonio Candir joined the color campaign, eventually they decided, well, this is what we're gonna do. I mean, it wasn't even in the campaign. The campaign, they were still discussing. Lula's team was discussing as well. Color's team was discussing as well. So in December, they decided, okay, this is what we're gonna do. And what motivated them, I mean, there's very little literature about it, but what seemed to have motivated them was the fact that inflation was really escalating, especially after the election. I mean, because, I mean, a new president is coming along, and probably a new stabilization plan is coming along. So we're going to have what's going to happen. So that's how, I mean, it really kept increasing, so they had to do. And the origins of the plan, like I said, there's a really big lack of documentation on how the plan came along. But Maria Henrique Simonsen actually says that it looks like two plans that were proposed in Germany, one in an interwar period, one right after the war. Carvalho, which actually he worked in the Lula's team and has written extensively about the color plan. He actually says that it does look like many of the other Latin American experience, such as the Manax plan, especially that was proposed in Argentina in 1989. Although the color team denies any kind of inspiration. But something that is very striking, there is a document, which is very hard to find, by Beluso and Almeida from 1999, before, I mean, it's from 1999, but it was actually circulating before. Some versions that were circulating before, which is actually very similar to what actually proposed the color plan. The color plan was proposed in the document called Exposição de Motivos número 58, and if you actually compare the two documents, you see that it was definitely, at least they used Beluso and Almeida for it, which is, it's something that it's also hints to that contradiction that you have about Zelia. I mean, she's in a liberal government, and yet she has very strong UNICOM ties. So this is something that the literature has established, that the color plan has very strong ties to Beluso and Almeida from 1989. And the color plan has four dimensions: a monetary reform, a fiscal adjustment, income policies, and structural reforms. I mean, usually people focus on the monetary reform because that's the most controversial part of the plan, but it has actually it has four dimensions, let's put it this way. The monetary reform by Zelia herself, que gerou todos esses problemas, it actually meant that you would block 50,000 cruzeiros novos, which is about, I would say, I think $1,500. I mean, for 18 months, and it would be returning 12 quotas from September 1991 at a 6% a year interest. If you consider the inflation was 90%, and if you were not that optimistic that government would be able to reduce that inflation, you'd see that that would be a very big, a very big long time for the government to return your money. The problem here was actually, there are several problems here. But the two main problems that the literature points to the monetary reform itself, the first one was the moeda indexada issue and the process through which debt was refinanced daily. The central bank then, they had a protocol, I would say that, I would call it that way, of refinancing its debt every day through the overnight, which was an operation in which banks would, to put it in layman terms, they would re-lend to the government overnight. That's what they call it that way. But the problem was that this process was actually automatic. It didn't depend on whether the government wanted or not. The banks had a guarantee that the central bank was actually gonna take this money, whatever money they put on the overnight, whatever money they put at disposal for lending, the central bank was gonna borrow that money. So the process the problem was that the public debt had such a liquidity at that time that the money supply was much larger than only the first monetary aggregate. So in this sense, you had a very big problem. That's why they blocked all this money that was all these confiscation of savings, like he was argue at the time, because the problem was not only the immediate liquidity of the money in the hands of the people, but all the other financial operations that people had. They also had very high liquidity as well. The second problem was the sudden increases in aggregate demand that follow stabilization plans, and the trauma of the Cruzado plan especially was very high in their minds, so much that the Collor plan actually had a price freeze as well, which was, I mean, with such a confiscation, I mean, people thought, why do you need a price freeze? I mean, people, this is traumatic enough. You don't need a price freeze because, like, we don't even gonna have money to spend on anything anyway. The second type of measures were the second and third were the fiscal adjustment and the income policies. It was a very tough fiscal adjustment. It was a 10% adjustment, trying to aim for a 2% fiscal surplus. So it was a plan that really tried to adjust, to reduce, I mean, mostly focused on reducing expenses, not much increasing revenue. But it was actually very well received. This is something that people don't really realize. The history view of the Collor plan was that it was an awful plan, that people actually hated, that the view of Zelia was actually terrible. But if you think about it, I mean, Fernando Sabino actually wrote a book about her. He put his reputation on the line for her. Right after she left the government, he wrote a book about her. Right after she left the government, she went on the Escolinha do Professor Raimundo, Chico Anísio. That's when she met Chico Anísio. Eventually, she married him. He opened the space for her so she could say goodbye from people. She actually did not enjoy such a repulsion. She was not, I mean, the monetary reform was very controversial, but for example, the fiscal adjustment, actually, most economists actually thought, some people actually thought it was not tough enough. So she was not that, I mean, at the time, she was not seen that negatively. I mean, some people in the press thought she was, did not see her very well. Many people did not see her very well because of the monetary reform, but some aspects of the plan and of Zelia herself actually were very well received by society. It's something that history was probably not very fair to her into that sense. And like I said, price and salary freezes with a forward-looking indexation were kept, even though many people question why. I mean, since you have such a strong monetary reform like that, this is probably unnecessary. I mean, no effects here. And then lastly, they had structural reforms. And by her own words, she thinks, this is after, I mean, a few years after these reforms were put in place, as medidas estruturais deram muito certo. Here, it's the proposition of the National Privatization Plan. And here, I mean, Collor mainly started privatization. Most of the privatization was actually put into place in the Fernando Henrique Cardoso's government, but that's when he started the process. The industrial trade policy, which was came to be known as PC, and because this whole idea, I mean, this is something that many people don't realize. The Collor plan actually thought that industrial advancement was seen as a requirement for stabilization, that we had an obsolete industry at that time. And one of the main problems was that we needed to open the economy and we needed to push our industry further, because part of our problem, our price problem, was that we had very low competition, and that pushed prices. I mean, that did not help our inflation policies into this sense. And like I said, the reactions to the plan, the monetary reform was definitely seen as an undue state intervention. It was seen as ill-conceived. So here there's no way to defend that monetary reform. I mean, some people, like for example, Pastori, he wrote extensively saying how it was very inadequate. Some people like Simonsen also wrote about it. Fiscal adjustment was seen as not strong enough by some. Simonsen was one of the people who said that it could have been more than that. The income policies, and when I mean by income policies, I say, for example, exchange rates, salaries, price freezes. They were seen as reducing purchasing power of salaries and using an unnecessary and inefficient instrument, especially the price freeze. I mean, the reducing purchasing power of salaries usually comes from the left, that criticism. The price freeze was just, I mean, most people, it was just seen as it went by without most people realizing that it actually even happened. For most of the reforms, the structural reforms, the literature, or at least most people, the perception was that it super emphasized competition, and it focused less on competitiveness, which was bad because many companies actually did not survive the process. And Zelia herself, when she looks back at this process, she mentions reductions in imports, she mentions reductions in imports restrictions, in exchange rates restrictions, and in capital mobility restrictions. So that's why she thinks that those structural reforms were actually very positive for the country. That's why she sees it that way. And when we think about this, the plan itself, like I said, Andrade, who is actually Alexandre Andrade from our colleague at the department here, he argues that the plan was not that badly received by society at the time, despite its monetary reform controversy. And I concur with him. Like I said, I mean, she was not, and Zelia herself at the time, she actually had more popularity than most people give her credit for it today. I mean, she was probably judged more harshly by history than most people realized. One of the facts that we can put in terms of the plan itself was that it was approved by Congress by a large number, especially in the beginning of of Color's terms. He still enjoyed some popularity. I mean, he was just being pushed by the election. I mean, his political problems started a bit later on. And this differs very much from the academic view on the plan, especially the a posteriori view. I mean, the plan suffered from some criticism at the time, but like I said, some aspects were still well received. But after the plan failed, then the criticism really hit. I mean, it's easier to criticize something that failed than something that it's still going on at the time, and you don't know where it's going to hit. Other issues that I mean, plagued her turn as a minister of finance there. I mean, there was the war on Kuwait in 1991 when the Iraq invaded Kuwait, and that hit with an oil shock and other supply shocks, like agricultural prices went up, and that also harmed the inflation effort, the inflation containment effort that she was trying to do. Her personal life also draw a lot of attention to herself. I mean, it's actually terrible to mention this here, but the problem is you can never read about her without mentioning this. She had an affair with a Ministry of Justice at the time, and that's one of the reasons. I mean, some people actually put that as one of the reasons why she actually, I wouldn't say why she's fell, but why she lost some of the strength of the government. I mean, that lost some of the strength, and the corruption charges in the government, because it was very hard for her, being a member of the government, to how do I say, to distance herself from this charges, so much that when she left the government, she still had to respond. She was prosecuted. She was cleared from charges, but she was prosecuted from these charges as well as most of the other senior members of the Color government as well. And in terms of lesson for present time, which I think is probably the most important part of when you do a economic history exercise, I think one of the things that calls my attention when I look at a government like Color's government was that it came on very hard. I mean, when it started, it came on very hard with proposals of strong, ample reforms and fiscal adjustment, which is pretty much what we had when this government started. And but the problem was that, I mean, so much, if you can see, you have so many parallels. I mean, Collor also reduced the number of ministries. It reduced, I think, for 13 ministries as well. And we also had, I'm calling her Ministry of Finance, but at the time she wasn't actually a Minister of Fazenda. She was actually a Minister of the Economy, Minister de Economia. She also had a super ministry like Paulo Guedes has today, which eventually was broken down. Because they realized that it was so hard to coordinate such a ministry like that. One of the big reasons, actually, history, I'm not a specialist in political coordination like that, but one of the really big reasons people relate to Collor's impeachment is how hard it was for him to negotiate in Congress. And we see this today. And most of the promises, most of the agenda, that was proposed for at the beginning of the Collor government, it was actually so ambitious that eventually, because of the impeachment issue, it was aborted. And what we see today was that we also had a government with a very ambitious agenda, a very ambitious liberal agenda in the sense, which was aborted as well. So the lessons that, at least for me, is very clear is that we can never, I mean, for us to be ambitious, we need cooperation, we need articulation, we need negotiation. It's something that we can't reinvent the wheel. We need to, I mean, if something hasn't been done before, it's probably because it's very hard. So this is something that we need to go back and look at all we've done. I mean, we are still trying the same things for, 30, 40, 50 years. And probably one of the reasons that we haven't been successful before, it's probably because, we as a society, we have a very hard time negotiating with each other. And this is, for me, it's, well, I finish here. Thank you for all of you for your attention. Is Will able to get back?
Oh, yes. Andrea, many thanks for your beautiful presentation, and I apologize for the technical problems. Marvin was supposed to present to you, but his microphone simply did not work, and I was not here when you start your presentation. I have to solve a domestic problem, so unfortunately I did not did the proper presentation. But many thanks for your presentation, your very British English, and I think it's a nice contribution for our workshop. We are almost ready out of time, but I have a question for the audience. The question is from Marvin Davila.
The missing person here.
Yes. I was wondering what happened to Zelia after the fall of Collor's government. Any insights on that?
Well, she did, like I said, she married Chiquinizio after that, and he left for the United States on, for personal reasons. And after that, she just stayed there. She's working she has a consulting job in New York, and she hasn't returned ever since. From what I've inferred, I think she never felt comfortable returning because of the negative response, the negative feeling that people retain about her from the whole experience that she had as a minister. She never felt that comfortable. At least that's my perception about it. That she never felt, and she has a life there. She has a job there now. So I think she stayed there. She had kids there. So she's a consultant. She's an economic consultant in New York now. And with no plans to come back to Brazil, apparently.
I remember that some years ago I received some newsletter from Zelia Cardoso de Mello, but suddenly she simply stopped to send a newsletter, and I have no news about her no more. So, well, Andrea, I think that we are run out of time. Again, I thanks for your nice presentation, for your disposition to present, to deliver a lecture at our workshop, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank
Right?
you. Thank you so much for your invitation. It's an honor to be here.
All right. Many thanks. Now, I think that we start with Gabriel Porcilli. Gabriel Porcilli is already in the room.
Thank you. Hello, how are you, Jose Luis?
Hello, Jose Gabriel. In what part of planet you are?
No, I'm now in Montevideo, in Uruguay, which is possibly one of the most dangerous places in the world in terms of COVID, because we are having a very important spike in cases and deaths per capita. So I'm in a very empty office. Already with 2 vaccines, so vaccinated twice with Sinovac. This means that I will become a jacare very soon. So
You became a communist, Jacare.
it's my opportunity to interact with the human beings.
All right. So we'll start your presentation, but before I have to present you, well, José Gabriel Porcilli Meirelles is his complete name. Gabriel Porcilli has a master's degree in economics from the State University of Campinas and a PhD in economic history from the London School of Economics. He is a professor of economics at the Federal University of Paraná and economic affairs officer at the Economic Commission for Latin American and Caribbean. He has been a visiting scholar at the University of Columbia, the New School for Social Research, and the University of Republic from Uruguay. His field of research is growth and distribution in post-Keynesian models, in particular, balance of payments constrained growth models and the political economy of Kaleckian growth models. He has published extensively in several journals in Brazil and abroad, among which the Cambridge Journal of Economics, Oxford Development Studies, Research Policy, Ecological Economics, and Structural Change and Economic Dynamics. And he was also a senior member of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group, which of course is his most important quality. All right. And Gabriel had a collection of very nice jokes, but unfortunately censored for this time, for this part of the day, because of children in the audience. But you cannot tell those jokes that he tell to me when we are colleagues at the Federal University of Paraná. But one of the best jokes that I have heard in my life was told by Gabriel Porcilli about people that live in the state province of Rio Grande do Sul. But I will not tell the joke here, because I think that Adalmir Marchetti is seeing the conference, and I think that he will not like too much the joke that you told about Cautious. Well, Gabriel Porcilli, take your time. You can start your presentation, and the audience is yours.
Thank you very much, Jose Luis. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. I'm very happy to be part of this seminar. I will share my screen. So let me see if Windows on screen. Okay. I'm not sure. Share screen. I'm not being allowed to share the screen, I think. Let me see. Aquí, okay, hello. Perfect. Are you able to see the screen now? Can you see the screen?
Yes, we are seeing.
Okay. So, the topic of my presentation is about the concept of building back better. You know that ECLAC and United Nations have argued the necessity of changing the pattern of growth. We have to respond to the crisis, the COVID crisis, but we should at the same time try to reshape the style of development. And this concept of building back better has been put forward by these institutions. On the other hand, there is very little analytical content in this idea of building back better. And the effort in this presentation is to try to produce an analytical framework in which the different parts of the concept of building back better can be put together and interact with each other. The idea of building back better is the idea of sustainable development, and sustainability has three dimensions. This concept implies three dimensions. One is an economic dimension, which is the idea that the style of development should allow for convergence in GDP per capita between the periphery and the center countries, between the developing and developed countries, this convergence based on the reduction of technological of the gap in technological capabilities. The idea is to close the technology gap or to catching up in technology. There is a social dimension in the concept of sustainable development, which is the idea that growth should be associated with a radical fall in inequality. Inequality is a big challenge, and sustainable development, to be socially and politically viable, it needs to promote equality. And the third dimension is the environmental dimension. Growth should respect the limits of nature, should preserve and protect natural resources, biodiversity, avoid climate change. This is also a key part of the change in the style of development. How we put together these three dimensions, this is an analytical challenge in which I believe that different strains in heterodox economic thinking could be combined and are especially useful to have a consistent, coherent theoretical argument in favor of sustainable development. Economic sustainability, we believe that this dimension can be captured by the idea of the balance of payments constraint rate of growth. The idea is that economic growth, to be sustainable in the long run, it should take into consideration competitiveness, technical change, and structural change to transform the economy and raise the balance of payments constraint rate of growth. This is, we have an equation that can express this rate of growth, which is the traditional first world law, is very well known among heterodox economists, and we can summarize the idea saying that from an economic point of view, the rate of growth, which is sustainable, depends on the income elasticity ratio, which is the ratio between the income elasticity of exports and the income elasticity of imports times the rate of growth of the center. In a center periphery system, the way in which the periphery can increase its rate of growth with external equilibrium is by transforming the production structure, the pattern of specialization.
You're not changing your slides. We are seeing just the first slide.
I don't know. In my computer, I already changed it. Let me see. I will
put on presentation mode. Put on presentation mode.
Let me see.
You're just seeing your first slide.
Okay. Share screen. Now you see the change or not?
I'm not seeing your presentation.
Because sorry about that. You are sharing another application window. This is the message that I have. I don't know if you can see the presentation now.
No, yes, now yes.
Okay, so you can see the basic balance of payment constraint growth equation, which is the slide.
Well, seeing the slide number 2, you have to click on your computer in order to change it.
It is changing now?
No, it's on the second slide yet.
Now it's okay. The basic.
No.
This is my. Yeah. You can see the slide saying economic sustainability, balance of payments, constraint growth.
No, the 3 interrelated dimensions of sustainability is what I'm seeing now.
But I already changed it.
No, I'm seeing your try to present the slides. Yes, now yes. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know why when I put in the presentation mode, it no longer changes the slide. I don't know why. Sorry about that. So I mentioned that we will try to put these 3 dimensions of sustainable development together, and we are using for that 3 rates of growth. The first is the balance of payments constraint rate of growth, which gives me an idea of the growth which is sustainable from an economic point of view, and this rate depends on the production structure and the pattern of specialization, which define the income elasticity ratio and hence the rate of growth of the periphery with external equilibrium. Now you see the next slide, it's okay? Are you seeing the change in the slide? Okay. To understand the dynamics of the income elasticity ratio and the pattern of specialization, we need to look at the dynamics of technical change, and this brings a Schumpeterian approach to our discussion of growth. In order to change specialization, we need to absorb technology, we need to transform our capabilities, and this can only be attained by industrial policy. The critical role of industrial policy in this point should be stressed, which is the idea that to accomplish this transformation of the economy, market forces alone will not be sufficient. You need to put in place very active industrial policies that should compensate for the inertial forces that reproduce the pattern of specialization over time, which are path-dependent, hysteresis, and blocking phenomena, which can only be overcome by industrial policy. Can you see the graph now, the graph of the productivity levels of Latin America, or you are still being unable to see my graph? Jose Luis, can you see the graph? A bridge too far? Jose Luis?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, it was just to be sure. So, this graph shows the evolution of the productivity of Latin American countries on average as compared to labor productivity in the United States. And you clearly see how we have lagged behind the United States, how the technological challenge, which is behind these trends in productivity, is so critical for Latin America. So, economic growth, sustainable from an economic point of view, related to technology, to productivity, to the transformation of the production structure. But in addition, we need to think of a rate of growth, which is the minimum rate of growth necessary for having social and political equilibrium. Why? Because we need to create formal employment. We need to absorb this labor in the subsistence and informality into formal employment with high productivity. This is the discussion to which Jose Luis and Peter Scott referred in the presentation of Peter. So we have a part of the labor force allocated in the subsistence sector, and we have to push to absorb this labor force in the modern sector. And this is a critical condition to boost equality, to curb inequality in our countries. A minimum rate of growth is necessary for strengthening the hand of labor in wage bargaining, and also to collect the taxes and the public revenues necessary for social protection and for public investment. So we have this minimum rate of growth, which is a rate of growth which the structuralist economist Julio Oliveira and more recently Martin Rapetti as well have denominated the rate of growth necessary for social equilibrium. This is a graphic representation of the model I'm discussing here. You have on the left, on the x-axis, you have the rate of growth of the center. On the coordinates in the y-axis, you have the rate of growth of the periphery. This is the schedule produced by the third-world equation, in which the rate of growth with external equilibrium of the periphery increases with the rate of growth of the center, and the slope of the schedule equals the income elasticity ratio, the income elasticity of exports divided by the income elasticity of imports. The rate of growth of the center is given in y bar c, and the equilibrium rate of growth for the periphery is in point A, which in turn implies a certain wage participation in GDP, which is the sigma on the graphic on the right. The sigma is the weight share in GDP. The higher the rate of growth of the periphery with external equilibrium based on technology, the higher will be the strength of the labor force in wage bargaining, the level of employment in the formal sector, and the wage share in GDP. If the economy grows in A, the wage share will be also in A on the right, but we need a higher rate of growth if we want to improve equality. If we go for equality, we need a wage share defined by point B on the graph in the graph on the right. So we need structural change to shift the schedule of the balance of payments constraint from TB0 to TB1. If we succeed in doing so, we are having convergence because we are above the 45 degree line in which center and periphery grow at the same rate. And at the same time, in point B, we have changed the conditions of the labor market in favor of labor in such a way that we now can attain this objective of equality and income distribution, which is so critical for political democracy. Finally, we have the environmental dimension of our analysis, and for addressing this environmental challenge, with Jeff Althaus and Giulio Guarelli, we work in a paper published in Ecological Economics to produce what we called the center-periphery environmental frontier, in which we define the maximum rate of growth of the periphery, which is consistent, compatible with the commitments that the periphery, and in particular the Latin American countries, assume in the Paris Agreement with the national determined contributions. You know that there was a great convention in Paris in which the problems of the environment were discussed. And from these agreements, the countries decided or voluntarily proposed some goals in terms of the reduction of carbon emissions in the next years. So, taking into consideration the promises that the Latin American countries made after the Paris agreements in the national determined contributions, we can estimate what is the rate of growth that these countries could attain to fulfill these commitments if they do not change their rate of emissions per unit of GDP. The only way in which the countries of Latin America could grow at a higher rate while at the same time keeping their promises in the national determined contributions is to decouple emissions of CO2 from economic growth. This is the technological challenge they have if they want to grow at higher rates. If they don't do this technical change, they will have to grow at a very unlimited rate in order to avoid emitting more CO2 than what they have promised in Paris. So graphically, we can represent the center periphery environmental frontier as a negatively sloped curve in which the rate of growth of the center, of course, imply more emissions and less space for the periphery to grow and also emit CO2. But also there is a technological component in this curve. If innovation and technical change decouple, succeed in decoupling emissions from growth, then the frontier shifts to the right, and we can attain an ideal situation, which is represented in point A, in which, from one hand, competitiveness allow the periphery to grow at a higher rate of growth. Innovation and energy transition allow to reduce carbon emissions and make this rate of growth compatible with the national determined contributions. And this rate of growth in point A, consistent with external equilibrium and with environmental frontier, is at the same time the rate of growth necessary for social equilibrium. So the question that one can ask at this point is the following. Do we have estimates of the value of these rates of growth so that we can somehow think of economic policy in terms of trying to achieve these different rates of growth and trying to make them to converge to the rate of growth necessary for social inclusion and equality? I mean, equality is a critical objective, and for our estimates, the rate of growth necessary for equality is higher than the rate of growth compatible with external equilibrium, and the rate of growth compatible with external equilibrium is higher than the rate of growth consistent with the promises we made in the national determined contribution. So we have a trade-off model in the sense that we need to grow for political and social reasons at a higher rate than we can grow because of our limitations related to the pattern of specialization of Latin America, and at the same time, even this rate of growth, which is by itself insufficient to encourage equality, even this rate of growth consistent with the balance of payment equilibrium is higher than the rate of growth that, if we not change the energy consumption and emissions by unit of GDP, even this so low rate of growth is higher than the one we should have if we are going to comply with the national determined contributions. We took India as an example, which is an average of the Latin American countries. And in this, India, we defined the rate of growth necessary for social equilibrium as the one we need in order to eliminate poverty in 2030. This is our social equilibrium rate of growth. We did the following. We considered the fall in poverty associated with the increase in employment and the fall in poverty associated with monetary transfer policies. We adopted the following strategy. We took 4 points of the GDP from the upper 10% in income distribution and give these 4 points in GDP to those in the lowest levels of income distribution in Latin America. It seems a lot. It is not easy to take from the elite of Latin America 4 points of the GDP. It seems a lot, but guys, look at, consider this. Such a policy will make all Latin America, this Bolivia, this average Latin American country, converge to the levels of equality of Uruguay, which is not so wonderful. So we are not suggesting to transform Bolivia in Dinamarca or Belgica. We are talking about moving towards a pattern of income distribution which already exists in a Latin American country, in Uruguay. So if we, in this average economy, move 4 points of the GDP from the upper 10% in income distribution to the lowest 10%, then the economy will attain this Gini distribution, which is similar to that of Uruguay. This rate of growth is about 4%. Sorry, I will come back to the graph just to show that if we do not, even with this very apparently radical pattern of income distribution, we cannot eliminate poverty in 2030 unless we grow at 4% per year. So this is the minimum that we need to grow if, with the necessary changes in income distribution, we want to eliminate poverty in 2030. This 4% is higher than the rate of growth, which is consistent with the income elasticity ratio and the rate of growth of the center in previous years. We are assuming that the center grows at the same rate as in the previous decades, and we estimate using conventional equations the income elasticity ratio. The conventional equation is rate of growth of the center and changes in the real exchange rate. So with this equation, we can estimate the income elasticity ratio. And from our estimates, Latin America may grow, this average Latin American country may grow without external disequilibrium, may grow at a rate between 1.4 to 2.5%. And finally, we estimated the trajectory of emissions of CO2 under inertial conditions in terms of technical change. If there is no technical change, and this is what you can see in the graph, emissions fell radically in 2020, of course, because there was a very strong contraction in GDP, which implied less emissions. Okay, but the promise we made in Paris is the green line in terms of emission, and you can see that the crisis, the COVID crisis, gives us a few years in order to make the changes necessary to change the trajectory of emissions. If we do not change this trajectory, if we fail to decouple emissions from GDP growth, then the maximum rate of growth we can attain without failing to comply with the Paris Agreement is about 1.2%. So really we are in a situation in which we need to grow at the very least, at 4% if we do a very strong redistributive policy. We can grow given the balance of payment constraint and given the complexity, the economic complexity of our economy and the pattern of specialization, we can grow at about, say, 2%. And if we want to be faithful to what we promised in Paris, then we cannot grow at a higher rate than 1.2% if we don't change the energy matrix and the type of technology we use in production in the direction of sustainability. So this is the challenge. This is what we could put together and discuss together and bring together the insights from ecological economics, the insights from the balance of payments constraint rate of growth, and the very important insights from the political economy of democracy if we want to have sustainable development. Just to conclude, we need a very strong policy of income distribution. We need to build what we never had, which is the welfare state, a welfare state in our country, social protection, universal social protection, education, health. All these are crucial, and we need to tax the elite and have a more progressive tax system. This is crucial in all the scenarios. This is why you see redistribution transversal in the triangle, to achieve 1S, which is the rate of growth required for social equilibrium. At the same time, on the basis of the triangle, we have technological progress, we have catching up, learning, industrial policy, technological policy. And this technological policy should move in two directions: reshape international competitiveness to rise the rate of growth consistent with external equilibrium, and at the same time promote the decarbonization of the economy in order to respect the limits that the global economy pose to us in terms of ecological sustainability. Respect the limits of the planet to economic growth. So technical progress is on the basis of our triangle, relating structural change and decarbonization in a way that allows the economy allows the convergence, I should say, between the rate of growth with external equilibrium with the rate of growth consistent with our national determined contributions. This is a very high challenge. Some things, some of aspects of these policies reinforce each other. I believe that equality improves productivity, improves technology, improves the quality of the industrial policy, because it is less likely that powerful concentrated interests could distort these policies in favor of the rentist sectors. And at the same time, I believe that the building of technological progress, the building of endogenous capabilities is crucial at the same time for moving towards decarbonization and moving towards structural change, and these things can reinforce each other. I stop here. Thank you very much. Sorry for the technical problems, and I say goodbye with this picture taken a few minutes after my vaccination in Uruguay. Thank you.
Okay, Gabriel, many thanks. We have some questions for the audience, but before I I pass to the questions of the audience, I have a few comments on your beautiful presentation. As you know, I'm working now with Giulio Guarini. I don't know if he was seeing us now, but we are working in the Green New Developmentalism. Well, as you know, the Latin American countries and Brazil, for sure, have passed in the last 15 years in a negative structural change because of the commodity booms, because of Dutch disease. We had premature industrialization and the growth of the primary sector, which in Brazil is basically the production of soybeans. The production of soybeans is extensive in land use. So in order to increase the production of soybeans, which is the basic commodity that produces the Dutch disease in Brazil, you have to put fire on the Amazon forest. So there is a link, a clear link between Dutch disease and CO2 emissions. So neutralizing Dutch disease is also a policy that will help to reduce the CO2 emissions. The first point. It's not a question, this is a comment for you to thought about that. And when we think on the manufacturing sector, which is shrinking in Brazil and other Latin American countries, we can divide the manufacturing sectors in two sectors. One we can call the brown sector, that use technologies that are extremely inefficient in terms of CO2 emissions. That means that they use too much CO2, they produce too much CO2 for each unit of output produced, but we can have green a green sector on the manufacturing sector that, on the contrary, uses much less CO2 per each unit of output. So I think that the question of the structural change is absolutely necessary for Latin American countries, not only to increase their growth rate, and you are absolutely correct, if there is not a minimum growth rate, it will be impossible to reduce poverty and to increase income distribution in Latin America, but also, and that's my point, but also to reduce CO2 emissions. So in Latin America, it's possible to have at the same time an increase in the rate of economic growth and a reduction in the CO2 emissions, because our growth rate is low due to the Dutch disease, and Dutch disease is related with CO2 emissions and to the destruction of the Amazon forest. So if we neutralize the Dutch disease, we will manage to have a good structural change toward the manufacturing sector, and that part of the manufacturing sector, which is the green industries, that are more efficient in the use or the production of goods using less CO2 emissions per unit of production. So that's what we are thinking now. My paper with Giulio Guarini will be published soon in the Brazilian Journal of Political Economy. So soon you and everyone will be hearing about the Green New Developmentalism. Well, but Mavio Davila has a question. I will read it, but also put in your chat, the private chat, so you can read it. Fighting climate change is going to require a large amount of natural resources Example, lithium in Bolivia for car batteries. Could this increase a new commodity cycle in Latin America? Any insights on that? Is the question of Marvila Davila Fernandez. And we have a comment of Daniel Peroso that I will put also in the private chat. The Gupta review exposes many of these points, but they are more elaborated here. Thank you very much. So there is a comment and a question of Marvilo Davila, and I ask you to be brief because we are almost run of time.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jose Luis. I haven't read the paper yet, but I know Jose Luis and I know Giulio Guarini, two people that I admire very much as economists. So I'm pretty sure that the green new developmentalism will bring very interesting analytical instruments for this discussion. For what you said, there are already, I can see already that there are very important complementary perspectives, and I think you put your finger in a critical question, which is to what extent these different objectives, economic, social, and environmental sustainability, imply a trade-off, or somehow they are strategically complementary. And you put an example of how changing the pattern of economic growth toward a more complex economy and away from the Dutch disease can help. These three objectives can help to social equality, can help the protection of nature, reducing emissions, and also allow for higher growth. So I think that looking at these complementarities, looking at these reinforcements between the different policies is very important. You know that there is this saying that if you have an objective, you need an instrument, and we have three objectives, we have several instruments, and the important thing here is that these instruments are not cancelling each other, but reinforcing each other. So thank you. I do agree with your comment, and I will be looking forward to reading the paper, which I'm pretty sure that it will be something that we will call the debate on these topics. About the possibility of a new cycle, I think if one looks now at what is going on in the commodity market and the role of China, I'm not so sure if we will have such a super cycle as we had in the first half of the 2000s. But I think, yes, that countries, particularly like Chile, will benefit from this new wave of demanding natural resources in order to feed this transformation in the economic structure. Again, this is not really a blessing because it may reinforce the concentration or specialization in primary goods. I would mention that if we take seriously the challenge of sustainable development, changing the economy and moving away from this dependence on primary exports is crucial. I would suggest to read in World Development, Camila Gramco from ECLAC in Brasilia, produced a paper in which the point raised by Jose Luis is empirically demonstrated. The complexity of the economy is negatively associated with the rate of emissions. So we have evidence in this direction, and of course this means that we have to escape from this reprivatization. About the Dasgupta review, I did not read the Dasgupta review. I will have a look at it. But yes, the idea of having a more elaborated framework is indeed to bring together a very interesting work made by heterodox economists. I think this idea of Keynes meets Schumpeter, which Giovanni Dossi proposed, have a field of application in the discussion of sustainable development. This combination of supply side policies and demand side policies, which Peter also referred to, all these are important contributions that we may try to conciliate and allow them to have a conversation in a single analytical framework. So that's so far my answer.
All right. Many thanks, Gabriel Porcilli, for your nice presentation of a very important subject for our research group. And I hope to see you soon as when the COVID-19 ends, and I expect that it will not will be in the short notice, but due to the lack of time, we have now to go directly to the next presenter, which is Elder Lara Ferreira Filho. Please, Luciano, put him on the screen. Luciano? Okay, here, Elder. So, Gabriel, bye. Well, we have the last presentation of this day, and I will make a brief presentation of Elder Lara Ferreira Filho, whom is a PhD student of the University of Brasilia. I'm trying to open the website in order to have your yes, now I have it. So Elder Lara Ferreira Filho is graduated in economics by the Federal University of Minas Gerais. He also made his master in economics by CEDEPLAR in the Federal University of Minas Gerais. He is a PhD. He's making his PhD in economics by the graduate program in economics of the University of Brasilia. His areas of expertise in economics with emphasis on public finance, economic growth, economic development, and industrial economics. He is also a researcher of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group. Since 2016, he works for the Finance and Control Agency of the federal government. Well, I think that's okay. Elder will present a lecture about the Calder visiting ECLAC, the Economic Commission of Latin American and Caribbean, an event that many people did not know that happens. Many of the Calder's ideas developed on the 60s had a very clear connection with the Latin American structuralism because of his work on ECLAC. So, Elder, the audience is yours. I just ask you to not go more than 20 or 25 minutes because today we are very late, right?
Okay, Professor Rayo, thank you for your presentation and for the invitation, and good afternoon to all. I will present this paper that Professor Rayo and myself were writing, called Revisits ECLAC, an initial turning point in his ideas. First, it's important to know that the Caldorian models nowadays are mostly known for the relevance given to the demand side of the economy and the concern about the sustainability of the balance of payments in the late 60s and afterwards. But in previous Caldor's works, like in the 50s, we can see some difference of method, as he used to apply equilibrium models to analyze process of economic growth, and also of substance, about the factors which would explain economic development. About the role of the exchange rate, Caldor has some skepticism in the 60s and in the 70s, but then he became enthusiastic about using exchange rate to promote export growth. And then later in his career, he became again skeptical about the role of the exchange rate on that. But this change that I introduced here stand out for Caldor, because initially always he was curious and finding new evidence and data about the economic process, but these changes occurred in a very interesting way. But it's not very common that people know that Caldor visited ECLAC in 1956 to produce initially work about the Chilean economy. Parts of the work were published years after because of political matters in some elections on Chile. And also, Furtado was invited by Caldor to go to Cambridge, which he did between 57 and 58. In short, the main objective of the article is to analyze these changes in Caldor's views throughout his career and discuss the possibility that the contact with ECLAC and its economists and members and researchers had an important role in the evolution of his thoughts. First of all, we will see the early contributions of Caldor until the beginning of the 60s. Caldor was born in Hungary in 1908, and between 27 and 47, he studied at the London School of Economics. Initially, he was very influenced by Hayek's and Robbins' ideas. He could indeed be considered an orthodox in the late 20s. At the same time, however, Caldor had contact and was influenced by Alan Young, the one that created or focused on the increasing returns theory, which was later applied as a central piece of Caldor economic thought. After the period in LSE, Caldor stayed 2 years at the Economic Commission for Europe, then finally moving to Cambridge University. Caldor thought it was necessary the direct observation of reality, consuming statistics and of other economists, but also being driven always by creativity and curiosity. Keynesian general theory of 36, of course, had a big impact at the time, and also for Caldor. For instance, in his 38 paper, he pointed out there was no natural tendency for full employment. But this assumption was left behind in the late 50s, when he developed some of his growth models. That was because we were living in the golden age, and the economies were booming, and still the employment there was actually full employment. So the full employment situation was for him then an stylized fact. In terms of methodology, Caldor showed the combination of his stylized facts that we know and some ideas from Milton Friedman, as he defended the as-if method in some of his papers at the time. Indeed, until mid-60s, Caldor worked on semi-informal steady-state models, which included assumptions that seem like neoclassical ones, as we'll see later, though with some difference. There are some differences that we'll stress out. The models of 57 and 58, for example, wanted to contribute to the debate about why some countries grow so much faster than others. Like the recently published model of Solo-Swan, Caldor points that the critical factors of determining the potential output are saving propensities, innovation, and growth of population. So, neoclassical assumptions. The system is stable only in full employment, also in both models. But Calder defends himself. It may seem paradoxical to label a model Keynesian. However, Keynesian apparatus of thought can be applied to full employment situations and not only to underemployment situations. An investment leads to saving, rejecting the view that capital availability could constrain growth. It's curious that quote from Calder. It certainly appears more correct to assume that output at any time is limited by the scarcity of resources rather than by effective demand. In his 58 model, Calder even used the representative agent he called a replica of the economy as a whole. However, Calder shows a clear discontentment about the neoclassical way to express technical progress, because he saw a large part of it was embodied technical progress. That is, he criticized the shifts in productive functions that are related only to change in output and capital. Calder 62 is another paper that basically continues his previous works in the 50s. There are lots of assumptions like passive role for savings, steady technical progress, exogenous rates of increase in the working population, and so on. But there are neoclassical assumptions and there are not so much neoclassical assumptions. For instance, he doesn't use a quantity of capital, and he doesn't use the production function that neoclassical economics use commonly. But technical progress is the main growth engine of growth. In sum, about this model of 62, Peter Scott said in his paper of 89, fundamentally, it's a neoclassical model. Then moving to the topic when we talk about the visit of Calder to ECLAC, we start to say, well, through the decade of the 60s, Calder changed many pieces of his own economic thought. But why is that? A possible factor is his contact with ECLAC and its members. Calder visited ECLAC in '56, like we said, and was invited by Prebisch at the time, initially to advise institutional fiscal policies for developing economies in the region. However, he ended up conducting a study about the Chilean economy, which was only partially published in '57, like we said, because of elections problems, elections concerns. In 1956, Calder still visited India, China, had other lectures in Japan, United States, and had short stops in Peru and Mexico, lots of American countries. Later, he went to Brazil, giving several lectures, including lots of topics, including, for instance, his first formulation to the link between agriculture and industrialization in developing countries. In Chile, he also gave lectures never published, including the principle of cumulative causation later. After that visit, Celso Portado himself was invited by Calder to go to Cambridge, which he did in '57 and '58. Indeed, it was the period when Furtado wrote Formação Econômica do Brasil, the economic growth of Brazil, one of the, or the best work by a Brazilian economist, maybe. During the 1960s and onwards, Calder focused on external factors of Latin American development. He wrote 2 more articles for ECLAC in '63 and '64, but when he became the economic advisor to the Labour government in the UK, he ended up reducing his visits abroad, including to Latin America. However, he continued to write about Latin American economies, particularly on the role of exchange rate on development and on the role of industrialization on development, like in Calder 1974, for instance. The model of 57, the paper of 57 for the Chilean economy, Calder was trying to understand why the country could present a disappointing performance of growth despite its high potentials in Calder's view. The answer would lie in the low private savings by the capitalist class because in an unusual way, the capitalist class was consuming luxury taxes a lot more than was expected. Also, he points that the Chilean persistent high inflation rate was an obstacle for development in the country. This high inflation rate was resulted from the capacity constraints, mainly in the agricultural sector, which produced an initial pressure on prices that were propagated with strong inertial mechanisms, commonly seen in the region. Calder realized that he would have to treat Chile, and also other developed countries, of course, differently compared to developed countries. A typical ECLAT idea. The theory of income distribution that Calder had for developed economies should change dramatically when applied to the less developed ones. It's incredible to notice that Chile had incredible unequal income distribution, but still a low investment rate. So the prescription would be for these economies changing its system taxation, including incentives to make firms retain more resources to reinvest, and also to restrain the luxury consumption by the capitalist class. Calder in 1957 did not follow a classical plea, however, about the importance of economic problems originated outside the country, such as the negative international division of labor, the unequal distribution of gains of trade, and so on. He still focused on domestic problems, as we see, the taxation and the inflation. Prebisch saw the necessity of a rapid industrialization as a prerequisite for development. For ECLAC, the comparative advantages could be acquired. It's not something static, like in models like Heschecker, Olling, and Samuelson. And of course, the drivers of economic growth are not the ones stressed out by the neoclassical solo-swan growth model. But, however, its industrialization and in terms of ECLAC's terms, it's a structuralist change in the economy. Other ECLAC's idea, which is also present in Calder 57, as we saw earlier, is the persistent high inflation rate and the origin of that, the structuralist view on inflation. That is, therefore, there are some elements of ECLAC in Calder's reasoning since his visit in 56, which were incorporated only in his models of the 60s. Also part of Calder's methodology probably has been influenced by ECLAC as well. From the second half of 1960 and onwards, Calder elaborates his economic thought in what we called a historical methodology, without formal models that he used to use before. Of course, other aspects were important for Calder change, like the growing literature of development, Lewis, Myrdal, Rosenstein, Rodin, Nurksey, and others. Or even the historical contest, with the beginning of the end of the Golden Age and the unemployment that came after with inflation. And during the 60s, Calder became increasingly dissatisfied with formal macroeconomic models by his own empirical research. He's not quiet, he's not stable, he's always looking for new solutions and new ideas. There was an excess of aggregation for him, and the assumption of growth constrained by supply side was implausible and failed to show a proper pattern of development. Now moving to the last phase of Calder's economic thought, we have his paper in 1966 that Calder wants to try to solutionate why Britain had this low economic growth rate compared to the other developed economies since 1950. For some economists at the time, the difference in the economic performance for Britain would be explained by the quality of institutions, education, the level of creativity of the population, all some theories that we see still today. However, for Calder, these factors could facilitate growth, but not drive it. For him, actually, the rapid economic growth episodes are associated with the fast growth of the secondary sector, especially even more for developing economies. Therefore, in ECLAC's terms, Calder is defending a necessary structural change. The manufacturing sector, as we know, has a high productivity and tends to attract labor force from other sectors with low productivity. And its technical progress is also higher, which are benefits from the sector. In his models of 66 and in his papers of 66 and 67, Calder said that the answer, because of the relation between manufacturing and growth, is because of the increasing returns theory, especially in manufacturing. A theory that was said by Smith and Alan Young and other classical economists, as you know. Productivity grows in response to increase in total output, indeed, because of economies of scale. That's what we call today Verdur's law. In the intermediate level of income, the process of import substitution is of great relevance, says Calder. This is a point also present in ECLAC's ideas, but with a slight difference, because Calder would stress that it's important to promote the exports, particularly the manufacturing exports. This last point seems to be the result of a process of considering some of ECLAC's ideas, analyzing them relatively to the facts and to the data, as Calder used to do in his reasoning, and take on his own conclusions. In Latin America, it's an important quote from Calder, curious one. In Latin America, which have experienced fast growth for a period, but which have failed to maintain the pace of development for very long, whereas in Japan, for instance, expanding its capital goods export enabled the phenomenally high post-war growth rate, showing Calder's interest on Latin America experience also. There is the so-called the Calder-Verdun law, that the acceleration of exports growth would lead to the more demand and more income, which would increase industry's productivity with spillover effects to other sectors' productivity, promoting another round of export acceleration. Calder in 67 lists some possible constraints for economic growth. That is, if a country is importing more than exporting, eventually the country will face a balance of payments problem. Also a typical idea supported by ECLAC. Interesting enough, he expanded this idea to the developed countries too, as United States or United Kingdom would have benefits to expand exports too. Calder did not see the exchange rate as an option at the time to relax this constraint, following to a traditional ECLAC's idea. For him too, savings cannot be a constraint, differently from earlier in his career. The investment leads to profits and savings, and the labor constraint can exist, but only in special conditions, because the majority of countries possess surplus labor in agriculture or informality or in services. Calder agrees partially with ECLAC on the necessity of high import tariffs, but for him only in special moments, in special stages of development, and in a Listian manner, because he defends only for infant industries and for a determined period of time because of his focus on exports. And discouraging exports would be a negative for economic development. Again, it's important to notice that Calder makes clear his concern about Latin America in his quote. Chile, Argentina, and Brazil each went through a phase of rapid growth following the establishment of highly protected tariffs or import prohibitions during the Great Depression, but was followed by a prolonged period of very slow growth and violent inflation. Some years later, in 71 and 72, Calder argues against some of his own previous ideas. In terms of substance, Calder changed his perception of the importance of the exchange rate, of increasing exports, seen as a legitimate and indispensable part of the international adjustment process. And the method he used to use his own first studies, the equilibrium economics, was totally refuted. mainly in his 85 article. In 72, defends finding regularity based on empirical evidence and discovering testable hypotheses capable of explaining this association, a different method he used before, the as-if method. For Calder, the scientific rigor commands that if the theories do not fit the facts, the theories need to be abandoned or at least modified. In the neoclassical economic theory, basic assumptions are unverifiable, says Calder, like, for instance, profit or utility maximization, or not supported by facts, like perfect competition and perfect foresight of the economic agents. Calder 672 also criticized the use of complex mathematical models and econometrics. For him, the vital mistake with economic theory has been the complete neglect of the existence of increasing returns and its consequence on the economic framework. With increasing returns, indeed, the proper notion of equilibrium becomes meaningless. And free trade is also affected with this, as it could be not beneficial to all nations potentially. In terms of the importance of the exchange rate, he goes back in the later stages of his career to a more skeptical view, like we see before, and supported by Eckler. For him, there were non-price advantages and not only price advantages. So he presents two practical difficulties for major currency devaluations, like the reduction of real wages and the impact on domestic inflation. Now, concluding my presentation, I would say that Calder was always concerned to check if the theories have some connection with reality. Initially, he was an orthodox economist, as we saw, but this changed with the influence of Keynesian general theory. Then, with the Golden Age, Calder saw full employment as a stylized fact. At the beginning of his career, he worked with models, formal models. Besides, in terms of methodology, he explicitly defended the as-if method, not necessarily paying attention to the historical context, like the members of ECLAC, for instance. Finally, the drivers of economic long-run growth, for him, were on the supply side, and not on the demand side or other things. What could have driven this change of Calder, we ask? We saw that Calder's visit ECLAC in 56, and Furtado Cambridge in 57 and 58, and Calder was always interested in Latin American countries, giving several lectures there. It's possible to acknowledge that the possibility that this visit had an important role in Calder's change of view later. In terms of relevance of the exchange rate in order to increase manufacturing exports, Calder shows in 67 and 78 a very similar skepticism as the one traditional by ECLAC. It's interesting to know, too, that Calder always cites many times the experience of Latin American countries, which can potentially be another hint of the impact of ECLAC and these countries on him. Finally, Calder has some destructive statements about equilibrium economics, mainly because of increasing returns, and changed his method of as-if to a more historical approach, like ECLAC would do. It's clear that there are some, not all, ECLAC's elements, which were introduced in Calder recently since 56. Maybe this visit made Calder go back to some of his earlier influences, like Liszt or Young. And we know that an evolution of thought involves other aspects. And in Calder's case, we say, for instance, the growing literature on development and the historical context. However, the fact is Calder changed dramatically his view on equilibrium economics, which was a change of method, and also changed his view about the engines of economic growth. For him, industrialization was the main one. Even for material economies, that's a classic ECLAC's idea, except for Calder that he stressed out the importance of export promotion. Therefore, it's highly probable that his visit to ECLAC had some impact on the evolution of Calder's work, maybe like an ignition to a change of direction. In addition, researchers are always supposed to main ideas and news. It's common that an idea seen earlier to appear forgotten until someone brings it up again and incorporates in some model or some new theory. Merton has a good quote on that that the signals provided by discovery are lost in the noise of the great information system that constitutes science. And only after some time it's incorporated in influences a topic or an author. Of course, our paper is not fully concluded. Indeed, we are reading some correspondence between Furtado and Calder, and there are some hints they had ideas exchanged that could potentially have influenced each other, both. I appreciate for your attention, and thank you all.
Many thanks, Elder, for your brilliant presentation. I'm seeing here in the chat of the YouTube, Virginia Gina says, this lecture topic is very interesting, excellent presentation. M. Freitas also say, good presentation. Gabriel Porcini made an appointment. Gabriel Porcini says, very interesting, Elder. I agree that Calder stressed the importance of manufacturing exports before most economists in Latin America. I would note, however, that already in the early 60s, Prebisch warned against excessive protection and called for overcoming the phase of import substitution. There is also a comment of Luis Fernando de Paula. Just one brief comment. Prebisch in his 60s works showed that besides import substitution, policies oriented to exports were important to overcome balance of payments constraints. So there is the comments from the audience. I will take the chance that we are now alive and we are authors of both authors of the article, and say that I think that, well, for everybody to know, we have an extensive exchange of emails with Professor Anthony Thiro, who is the biographer of Calder, and is probably today is the most important post-Keynesian scholar in the world. Professor Thiro shows a little skepticism about the influence of Eclac over Calder's economic thought. For Thiro, we have just a speculative argument with little historical basis to affirm that Eclac had an important role on the changes of Calder's economic thought in the mid-60s. But regarding of that point, I think that we have to insist on the paper. Basically, two things. In the 50s, there is anything in Calder writings or in the Cambridge School of Economics about two subjects. One, structural change. Two, balance of payments constraint. So these things appears in the Anglo-Saxonian word by the hands of Calder after the middle of 60s, after he had visited Eclac. And what I think that I did not read the 66 paper, but I read the 67 lectures of Calder delivered in the United States, which is called the strategic factors of economic development, and he made the issues that he raised in this 67 paper are very near to the Eclac's traditional position. First, he affirms that industrialization is the engine of growth. First. Second, he affirms that the first stage of industrialization is import substitution, but in order for the industrialization to continue, it has to be succeeded by export promotion. He divides the industrialization in 4 phases. The first phase is the import substitution of final goods, basically consumption goods. Then the second phase was the export promotion of consumption goods. The third phase will be import substitution of capital goods, and finally the fourth phase, where are the high income countries, is export promotion of capital goods. So, well, these ideas Prebisch had already expressed it. So, one criticism of Prebisch made early in his 1949 paper on the first lecture that he gives for the ECLAC in the year that ECLAC was founded, is that there are limits to industrialization of Latin American countries, and the limit is because the markets are very thin, and so was not a good idea to every Latin American country have all possible industries. They must specialize in some manufacturing industries and then have regional trade in order to increase the share of market for each one. So that's why how Prebisch was very optimistic and was a strong defender of Latin American trade integration. So I think that these ideas embed Calder's thought. It's very near about with ECLAC's position. Of course, that ideas are public goods. You know, it's no what is a public good is no exclusive and no what's the other feature? Non-exclusive and no rivalry. There's no rivalry and no exclusive. So once you have an idea and you publish it, well, everybody has access to this idea and can say that it's his own idea or not. Or just Leonardo Punzo once told to me that there is ideas are on a cloud, and people access the ideas on the cloud and use it for developing their own thought. So maybe we can make less stronger affirmations about the influence of ECLAC over Calder economic thought, because ideas are public goods. So we can never prove who is the father or the mother of an idea. Luis Fernando de Paula was asking, but who have the original idea, Calder or Prebisch? In terms of time schedule, Prebisch is absolutely guaranteed that the first, the idea that economic development depends on industrialization is present on the first document that Prebisch presents in the first section of the ECLAC in 1949, and it is in English. It's important. The document was translated to English. It's not published in any journal because it's an internal document for the United Nations. Remember that ECLAC is connected with the United Nations, is the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin American and Caribbean. So there is no excuse for anyone to say, oh, I do not know that he write that because it is in Spanish or is it in Portuguese, not in English, which is the language that every good economist must write. This paper was written in English and of course in Spanish. But I think that the idea of industrialization as the engine of growth is a Latin American idea. That's as a structuralist, a Latin American structuralism idea, and I think that yes, Calder was influenced by that, and he simply takes this idea to the Anglo-Saxonian world and completely change his ways of thinking on economic growth. Because if you read his stuff on economic growth, is basically his 1957 economic growth model, which is the consistent, mathematically consistent model. The 61, 62 model with Mirrlees is no consistent. There is no internal consistent. Peter Scott has already proved that. But in the 57 model, there is no structural change at all. What Calder introduces was a technical progress function where the rate of change in labor productivity depends on the rate of change of capital per worker, but in a steady state, the rate of change of productivity will be fully determined by the parameters of the productivity, the technical productivity function or technical progress function. And on contrary, that Tyrrell says to us in the correspondence, it's not true that on that model, the natural rate of growth is endogenous. The natural rate of growth on model, on Calder's 1957 model was not endogenous. It's at maximum, you can say that is semi-exogenous, because the natural rate of growth is determined by the parameters of the technical progress function, but is independent of investment and saving behavior. So effective demand has no role in the Calder's 1957 growth model. So that's effective demand only appears in Calder's thought on economic development in his 66 and 67 lectures. So it takes 10 years for Calder to change from a mainly supply side model, economic growth model, to a demand-led growth model. And we can speculate maybe that this change has something to do with his visit to ECLAC and his contact with both the ideas of Raul Prebisch and Celso Furtado. And I think that we have to stress this point. But now seeing your presentation, I think that the issue of the methodological stuff of Calder can be simply cut out of the paper because it's not relevant for the issue under discussion, which is the influence of ECLAC over Calder's conception on economic development. So the discussion on equilibrium and the criticism of neoclassical general equilibrium theory was not relevant. Prebisch do not like neoclassical economics, but because he was thinking about the Ricardian trade theory, so and Hatcher-Olling models, so on and so forth. I think that Prebisch do not have the knowledge about the theoretical knowledge about general equilibrium models in his latest form, is Zero-Debré models of general equilibrium. So I think that that part of the paper we can simply cut out and concentrate on the 66 and 67 papers of Calder and the relation with the prior ideas of Prebisch, which are published much before the Calder ever thought on this subject. Do you have anything to comment, Calder?
Yes, just to say that, of course, it's important. It's impossible that we know for sure that ECLAC had some influence on Calder. Indeed, because it was common at the time that the authors did not always cite the sources and so on. Including, for instance, Prebisch himself was always bothered because he did not formalize his model of the lagged sector and the
Center periphery country.
Yes, because it's very similar to the Lewis paper that later was nominated the Nobel Prize. So
Yes, the problem is that Prebisch never published it in a respected journal. So
yes,
he could, if he had published his ideas that he had in the 30s about center periphery, if he had published on American Economic Review, maybe Prebisch will be the first Latin American economist to win the Nobel Prize. So, but unfortunately, he did not publish on the journals that are considered respectable for the scientific community, and because of that, he did not win the Nobel Prize. But I think that he deserved it, and it's a pity that he did not win the Nobel Prize. For me, Hal Prebisch is the greatest Latin American economist of all times, and that's why Hal Prebisch one of the patrons of this research group.
yes. And in terms of methodology, Professor, the fact is that he used to use the as-if method and then became more like a historical approach. And he also emphasized the difference between developing countries and developed countries. So I think
This we can make a link with the Prebisch method.
yes.
This is important to talk about Prebisch method and the change in the method of Calder. I think that's important.
Some things in
Get
development.
our paper published in a respectable journal, not only in a conference. Well, but Elder, many thanks for your very nice presentation. Thanks for you all that are still together with us. And remembering that tomorrow will be the last day of this workshop, we will have a beautiful keynote speech made by Professor Jesus Ferreiro from the University of Basque Country that will talk about fiscal policy and its interaction with long-run growth. And then we will have just one graduate section where Professor Júlio Fernando da Costa Santos, that is professor from Federal University of Uberlândia, will present the Stockholm Flow consistent modeling as an alternative for neo-developmentalism to develop it formally its ideas. So see you tomorrow. Now for Brazilians, have a good afternoon, and for Europeans and our European guests, have a good night. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.